Good morning. Good morning. I'm Mary Woolley, President and CEO of Research America. And we're going to start our program today with a few remarks from the CEO of the AAAS, Rush Holt. Rush, you want to come right on up? Yeah. I'm just going to let you kick us off here.
Good morning, Mary.
And let me just, first of all, thank you so much for being our host.
Good morning. I'm Rush Holt. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of AAAS and Executive Publisher of our family of journals. I hope you know us. I hope you are members. If not, it's easy and worthwhile. I hope you read Science Magazine and our other journals. Again, they are worthwhile as well. As you may know, we're the world's largest general science membership organization, 120,000 members strong, more than 200 affiliated societies. And our mission, quite simply but grandly, is to advance science for the benefit of all people. It is a mission that has driven AAAS throughout its 170-year history. Part of advancing science is to keep track of and advocate for the conditions under which science can thrive. And it is in that general sense that we have participated in things like this morning's briefing to help the scientific community, the policy community, and the general public understand the place of science in our society, in our culture, and in our government, and to see whether the conditions necessary for science to thrive for the benefit of people are maintained. We will be talking today in this usually excellent program that Research America puts together about a number of aspects of how research and development, how science regulations, how science policies affect and will affect the people of this country and the world in light of the election results on Tuesday. So it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm glad to see such good attendance. I think you'll get a lot out of this program. Thanks, Mary.
So again, thank you, Rush, and welcome. This is going to be a very fast-paced program today with some candid discussion about what these historic midterm elections have meant for medical and health progress, for R&D writ large, and more broadly, for the process of policymaking, which affects all of these priorities. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker to start us off with some comments about the context that we should be thinking about our issues within. There is a broader public and political context. And to give us a glimpse of that, we have today the good fortune of having Reed Wilson with us. Reed is the national correspondent for the Hill newspaper and has covered politics also for the Washington Post, and he's the former editor-in-chief of National Journal's Hotline. He's also the Amazon best-selling author of the book Epidemic, Ebola, and the global scramble to prevent the next killer outbreak. So thank you, Reed, for being with us this morning.
Thanks, everybody, for having me. I really appreciate it. We're going to zip through some election results, but I thought I'd start with, when I was at the hotline, we sort of had an irreverent look at American politics, and we would every now and then add some titles to people, some sort of honorifics, if you will. And every time we mentioned Congressman Rush Holt in the hotline, we would say Congressman / Jeopardy champion Rush Holt. So there we go. The better way he should be known, of course. So I don't have a ton of time, but I want to start with just what just happened. How did Tuesday play out? What does it mean for the future of American politics? And what does it tell us about where we are as a country? There was a pretty significant wave that just took place. It may not look like it from the national level, but as the final results come in, and even since I put this together late last night, there have been a few more races that have been called for Democrats. The fact is, Democrats won more seats on Tuesday than they did in the 2006 election. 2006, you may remember, was the first election when Democrats reclaimed the House of Representatives after 12 years of Republican control, and they will once again control Congress as we move into the 116th next year. 222, it's actually, by this morning, I think we're up to 229 on the Dem side. Still some races to be called, and we'll go through that in a little bit. This is what the map looks like as of, well, no, not even last night. So since last night, this is a good example here. Does this thing have a, no, maybe not. Southern New Mexico, that district that is a shaded light red there is now a blue seat. There are 9 congressional districts along the U.S.-Mexico border. Democrats have held 6 of them before election night. They will hold 8 of them, and that big, long district there in Texas, the Republican incumbent is leading by about 1,100 votes, with some still left to be counted. So up in Northeast Maine, there's a fascinating experiment going on. The first time a U.S. House seat will be decided by ranked choice voting. Which is something that's never happened in American history before. I just saw a little fist pump over there. Some fans of ranked choice voting in the room. I love it. But the thing I want you to pay attention to in all this is just where the Democrats picked up seats. And they picked up a hunk of seats in all of these black circles here. What is similar to these, to Orange County and Los Angeles County down there in the bottom left, or the Miami area in the bottom right there, New Jersey suburbs all around there, the Detroit suburbs, Kansas City, all of these places are either places that Hillary Clinton won in 2016, or they are suburban swing districts where President Trump's approval rating is pretty dismally low. And that's the real story of what happened in this election. The suburban electorate, which has been pretty closely divided in recent years, swung pretty heavily towards Democrats in this particular election cycle. And I think there is going to be some long-term ramifications for that going forward. Take a look, too, at some of the places where Democrats won, where you wouldn't think that the party would have won. In 2016, Hillary Clinton lost every single county in the state of Oklahoma by more than 55%, and Democrats just took back a House seat in Oklahoma City. Same thing in Utah. A state that, well, President Trump didn't do terribly well there because of a third-party candidate, but Mitt Romney 4 years ago swept every county in Utah, and Democrats just took back a House seat there. Again, Kansas City and some of those seats in southern Miami were seats that Republicans have held for basically since the Kennedy administration, and they have just flipped. The story is a little different in the Senate, and this underscores, I think, a big, significant difference in the battlegrounds that were at stake. Whereas suburban voters decided who controlled the House, it was rural voters who decided who was going to gain in the Senate, and that's largely because of the states that were up. Of course, all 435 House seats are up every 2 years, but in the Senate, it's only a third of the seats. This year, the people who won in 2012 were up on the ballot this year in some states that President Trump won by 20, 30, in some cases even 40%. Back in 2016. So you can see that Republicans picked up seats in Missouri, Indiana, and North Dakota. 3 states that weren't even competitive back in 2016. It appears they've picked up a seat in Florida, though of course it wouldn't be an election without a Florida recount. So we're of course headed towards a recount. Bill Nelson narrowly trails the incumbent governor Rick Scott down there. The only seat that Democrats have picked up so far is in Nevada, where Senator Dean Heller has lost. Arizona is still up in the air. Arizona is a narrowly divided state right now. Congresswoman Martha McSally leads by about 16,000 votes. There are 650,000 votes yet to count. About 2/3 of those, maybe about 3/4 of those are in Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is. Sinema has narrowly led in Maricopa so far, so we're still in recount territory here, and it's going to be quite a while until we know who the next senator from Arizona is going to be. The big thing, and I spend most of my day covering what happens in state politics, basically everything outside the Beltway. So the big thing that I paid attention to on, God, what night was that? It's a good thing we didn't do this yesterday because I didn't remember where I lived yesterday. But on Tuesday night, the real big movement was among governors. Now, Republicans had done so well in 2010 and 2014 that they controlled 2/3 of the governorships around the country. Now, the split is very close to 50-50. The Democrats have at least 23 of the 50 governorships around the country. Georgia is the one that's still on the board, pending a potential runoff in December, given the last couple of ballots that have yet to be counted. But you can see Democrats picked up 7 Republican-held seats in states that were open, like Nevada, New Mexico, Maine, and Michigan, by the way, and they knocked off Republican incumbents in Wisconsin and Illinois. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker running for his 3rd term. It's really hard to run for your 3rd term, especially when you've just run for president, to come back and sort of convince voters that you still want to be there. The big shocker to me was in Kansas, where a state senator named Laura Kelly won election over the Secretary of State, Chris Kobach. You might have known him most recently from being reprimanded by a federal judge for not knowing criminal proceedings or trial proceedings when he was reprimanded out there. But the fact is, Democrats did hugely well here, and I think this underscores a little bit one of the broader stories of the 2014 election. In Maine, in Kansas, and in New Mexico, the Democratic candidates who won were women. This was, in fact, the year of the woman. Not only did women favor Democratic candidates by such a huge margin in those suburban races, but women candidates of both parties won more seats than they ever have before. For the first time in American history, in the new Congress, the 116th, when they convene in January, more than 100 members of the House of Representatives will be women. So. And by the way, we set a record in governorships, and I haven't gotten through all the state legislative races yet. There are about 6,000 of them that were decided on Tuesday, but you can imagine that women did incredibly well there too. The late-breaking House results has just been like a bloodbath in favor of Democratic women in that seat in southern New Mexico, in the Atlanta suburbs in Georgia, in the Seattle suburbs out by Mount Rainier. Women candidates have been winning all of these late-breaking races. So my tally right now is at 101. I think it's going to go up to 104, 105 by the time we're all is said and done. What this gets to, though, is a sort of a fundamental divide between urban America and rural America, one that has existed basically for the last decade since the end of the recession. This is the presidential results in 2016 by county, and it shows you that we are dividing not just in terms of culture or politics, but even geographically. We're sorting ourselves. Back in 2000, George W. Bush won about 500 counties in America with more than 70% of the vote. Donald Trump won 1,500 counties with more than 70% of the vote back in 2016. The number of Democratic-heavy counties increased it doubled from 49 to 99, and we see this happening all over the place. Basically, the post-recession economic and social story that has started to infect our politics, that is infecting our politics, is a deeply divided recovery, one in which the megacities in the U.S. have thrived and succeeded, and where rural America is still struggling. In fact, rural American counties still don't have the same number of jobs as they did before the recession. That's pretty stunning. By the way, this is just a funny little bit. I like to sort of overlay this economic story with the culture wars that we've been seeing, and even the way that we all behave as consumers. As it turns out, there's a pretty good correlation between how we behave as consumers and how we actually vote in November. So this is a map of television media markets around the country. The darker the red means more people were watching than average. The darker the blue means fewer people were watching than average. So you can see that for this one particular television event, it was very popular in the South, in the Rust Belt, parts of Northwest Indiana, not so popular in the Bay Area or New York. Anybody have a guess as to what this TV event might be? What was that? What? Super Bowl? No, everybody watches that. If only for the commercials, right? No, Sean Spicer says everyone watched that. The Oscars? No, not quite. I think that would be the reverse of this map. It's the season premiere of Duck Dynasty. I hope nobody hasn't had breakfast yet, because... But there is an actual correlation between what we watch on TV and what we purchase and all of this, and our consumer and societal behavior and how we turn out to vote. I'll skip past this. We've got question and answers in just a second, but I want to focus on this. There is a pretty good correlation between what you like to drink and how you actually vote once you get in the voting booth. How many of you have one of those little key tags on your keychain that gets you, 10 cents off yogurt at the grocery store, right? Okay, pretty much everybody does. The corporations use that to figure out how you're going to behave when you're spending money at the grocery store. Well, it turns out political parties can use that to determine pretty much how you're going to vote come November. They use up to 4,000 data points, everything from whether or not you're registered to vote, which is a pretty good sign that you're going to vote or not, to what you like to buy at the grocery store to get... to build a score for you and decide how you're going to vote. So the thing I'll leave you with on this is that, as you can see at the very top, Chateau Saint Michel, Columbia Crest, Kendall Jackson, Robert Mondavi. The vertical axis here is how likely you are to vote. Turns out wine drinkers show up to vote on Election Day. If you're drinking Don Julio or Jägermeister, you're probably not showing up, right? And this is the fun part, the last point I'll make, it turns out the darker your spirits, the more Republican you're likely to be. So on the very right there, Wild Turkey, Jim Beam, Canadian Club, bourbon and scotch and whiskey drinkers, you're probably Republicans. Absolute, Grey Goose, Smirnoff, you're probably Democrats if you're drinking vodka. Try this at your next dinner party. Actually, no, don't do that. It's terrible. But anyway, I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to jump around on these slides here. I think there are a couple of microphones there, but we've got a few minutes for questions if you want to ask about what happened on Tuesday or why we're such a divided country. So thank you all so much for having me. Anybody? Oh, come on. Yes, sir.
So we saw an average of about a 10-point swing.
Oh, there we go. We got cameras, so. I could hear you, but TV guys can't. There we go.
So we saw on average about 10-point swing to the left across all the House races, but we barely took more houses than the Republicans took in 2006. How much of that's a function of gerrymandering across the country? You would have expected 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a much larger swing for the House given that percentage.
Well, I'm not sure you would have. The difference... So when Republicans won the majority of Congress in 2010, they picked up 63 seats in the House of Representatives. The fact is, the Democrats actually got more votes. for U.S. House seats than did Republicans. But that's not the way we run our elections, right? And the gerrymandering is a long American tradition that actually goes back to 1812 when Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts drew a district that hindered his rivals, the Democratic, or the Federalists rather. He was a member of the Democratic Republican Party. Imagine if those still existed. The local paper said the district looked like a salamander. It was Gerry's salamander. It's a gerrymander. That's how we get the word. The fact of the districts as they're drawn now is partially a function of good political map making, and both parties do it. Illinois is pretty heavily gerrymandered for Democrats, so is Maryland, and actually there's a court that just struck down the Maryland maps just yesterday, I think. But the fact is, because of where Democratic voters live, Democrats are always going to get a huge number of votes out of America's big urban cores. Now, it's tough to draw those big urban cores into multiple districts. So you're always going to have Democrats who are winning with 85 or 90% of the vote in downtown New York City or Philadelphia. And those votes, you can't distribute them to other parts of the state. So the fact is, Democrats need a bigger advantage on the generic ballot, almost no matter how you draw the districts, in order to win more seats in the House. Now, there are a lot of states in which the Republicans have done a very good job of drawing the maps in ways that favor them. And that probably cost the Democrats 10, maybe 15 seats in this year's election. But the fact is, populations change. And we haven't drawn districts since the 2011, before the 2012 election. And yet you saw, in some cases, new districts that were drawn ordered by courts in Pennsylvania, where Democrats gained a huge number of seats, in places like southeastern Pennsylvania and even western Pennsylvania, that redrawn maps can make a big difference. That's why Democrats care a lot these days about state legislative races, because it's those state legislatures who are going to start redrawing the districts once we get to the 2020 census. About 1 in 6 state senators who were elected on Tuesday are still going to be around come redistricting in 2022. So, or I should say 1 in 6 state legislative candidates. So the redistricting process has begun, and whoever wins in 2020 will determine not just who controls that Congress, but probably who controls the Congress for the next decade. There we go. Anybody else? Oh, come on. Yes, sir. There's a mic right next to you. I don't want to get you in trouble.
Could you talk a little bit about economic issues and social issues, how they played in the election? And then I kind of put healthcare kind of off on its own little shelf.
Yeah, healthcare was by far the most significant issue that voters were thinking about when they went to the polls on Tuesday. And that's because the entire Democratic campaign in areas from suburban Philadelphia to the heart of Oklahoma City were all about healthcare and pre-existing conditions, right? Democrats won the healthcare voters by about 3-1. The number 2 issue there was, we call it immigration, but it's really a sort of cultural, the cultural issues that President Trump spent the last week or a month or so on the campaign trail warning about. Immigration voters broke about 2-1 for Republicans. It was not quite the advantage that they hoped it was. And interesting to see, by the way, that the day after the election, the Pentagon has decided to rename the operation to race to the border and stop this caravan that's 1,000 miles away. Shock and surprise. It's almost like they were playing politics. But the point is, economic issues played a very small role in this year's election. Gallup asks this great question that I absolutely love it when they do. They say, what's the most important issue facing America today? And then they don't offer options. Just open-ended, say what you think. And at the height of the recession, about 85% of Americans said something to do with the economy. Jobs, wages, unemployment, something like that. By this year, it was about 15%. People don't care about the economy when it's going well. You don't care about a problem when it's not a problem. But healthcare was a massive problem that voters were focusing on, and more than 40% of voters said that healthcare was their top issue as they went to the polls. More than 20%, 22, 23% of voters said immigration was a big issue, and then there was sort of a smattering of everything else down in the teens or the single digits. So it has been about the economy for the last decade. It was not this year. And we'll see what happens with the stock market as we go forward. So, yes, ma'am.
Thanks, Reed, so much. And one of those slides that you skip by without having a chance to talk about is about trust. There we go.
There we go.
Do you have high trust? And I think this is really important for all of us to think about, not only to be aware of who people say they have the highest trust in, and we see the Congress, by the way, all the way over there on the right, you know, but also to notice what isn't there. That it doesn't say scientists, has the medical system, but doesn't say scientists. So I was talking to Reed earlier about how, in our experience, and as probably most of you know, we commission public opinion polls regularly. And if you put, we find that in polls we commission, that if you put scientists on the list, they do very well. As well, right under military and church, religious leaders say. And there are some other surveys that have shown that. But I think the most important point here, and Reed, I'd like to hear your thoughts too, is that the science community remains relatively invisible to pollsters, Gallup, unfortunately, to the American public. And we've got a lot of work to do if we want to raise our visibility and impact as advocates. So, but Reed, your thoughts.
Yeah, and this is, after we talked, I looked up, Gallup asked this question every year, do you have a high level of trust, or do you think this profession has high ethics? I looked, unfortunately, they don't ask it about scientists. So the next time I sit down with Frank Newport, the head of Gallup, I will make sure that I put in a plug for scientists. But the fact is that science is rarely at the top of a political agenda, in large part because it feels so big, right? It's what is one member of Congress going to do about climate change? Now, there's an answer to that, but that's a tough thing to motivate voters on, especially when an economy is top of mind, and whether or not you can feed your kids is a big deal. So I think there's an abstraction to science that doesn't necessarily translate well into political advertising. And unfortunately, that's the way we have conversations these days, is in 30-second spots about pre-existing condition or why the other guy's a bum. You see Congress, by the way, at the very bottom here. John McCain had a great line. He always used to say, the only people who still approve of the job Congress is doing are blood relatives and paid staff. I happen to know a lot of the paid staff, and I don't think they approve either. By the way, do you have very high or high ethics, or do you think these professions have high ethics? Most Americans think doctors have high ethics, so that's getting into the science realm there. Nurses, doctors, but heaven help you if you're a car salesman, a congressman, or a lobbyist out there on the side. I made a joke about, heaven help the former congressman who's now lobbying for car salesmen once, and some guy in the back was like, "That's me." Oh, jeez. Anyway, so I think I've got to stop there. You all were wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
So I think you'll agree that was really, well, oh, see, look, there's more that we didn't get to see. Maybe, will you let us share your slides? Oh, see, look.
You can do this one, right? This is all the people who could run in 2020.
Look at that. See? So we're gonna move on now to talking about the very topic that Reed finished up with, and I asked the question about, which is, how do we connect to the voter, to constituents? And we have a program that we kicked off in the summer this year on just that topic. And these are the supporters who joined with us. The point of this is to ensure that we have meaningful conversations with candidates related to science and innovation. And for many years, every election cycle, Research America has been engaged, sometimes with some of you as partners, sometimes on our own, to do just that, to engage candidates. And back in the day, we did that via surveys, questions that we asked people, questionnaires. But increasingly, many, if not most, candidates running for office don't want to participate in surveys and questionnaires anymore. So we needed some new ideas. And we decided to ask young scientists for their ideas. Because we know that young scientists care deeply, that demonstrated that, especially in recent years, by marching for science, by being actively engaged in many ways. So we, in partnership with a group called the National Science Policy Network, and with funding support from these 15 scientific societies and the Rita Allen Foundation, we provided micro grants to 10 postdoc and grad student-led science policy groups. And you can see from this map where they were located across the country. We had more proposals even than that, but we were able to fund 10 of those. So we're pretty excited about this. We've begun to learn from the groups just what they were doing and what the implications are. Here's a few glimpses. So in Wisconsin, the group organized and had a policy and policy training workshop, as you can see here, and it included some time with the candidates for Secretary of State, which is terrific that they would make the time and come and talk with the student groups. By the way, Mr. La Follette won, he was the incumbent. In the state of Washington, there were conversations with community leaders as well as a member of the current serving member of the state Senate, and you can see the rest of the folks gathered there. They found that a very engaging, plan to continue that kind of effort. In fact, I'd say that's the theme song, that everyone is planning to keep up their work now that they've kind of gotten their feet wet. Here is a group in Vanderbilt just talking about the incredible rewarding experience that it was for young scientists to meet and interact with candidates who are running for office. And then switching to the University of California, San Diego, we see more on this. Lots of people turned out, and coffee with the candidates at the Medical University of South Carolina. So, I think it's just really impressive what these groups have accomplished around the country and their passion and energy to keep it up, to keep it going. And I certainly hope that all of us who are in a position to help support that work will keep up your support. It's critical. We have a great opportunity this morning to hear right from one of the leaders of these groups what the experience was like from her perspective. So I'm very happy to introduce Rachel Owen, the co-founder of the Missouri Science and Technology Fellows Program. Come on up, Rachel.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I am really excited to get to share a little bit about our program in Missouri, as well as the events that we hosted leading up to the midterm elections. So I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Missouri. My co-chair, Mike Hendricks, is unable to be here today. He's also a PhD candidate in political science. But we've been doing this together since the very beginning, and so I want to make sure that I acknowledge him and all the work that he's done on this project. And we also now have 5 other students who help us out. We're growing and trying to promote science policy in Missouri. So the Missouri Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program, or we say MOST because it's kind of a mouthful. MOST was formed in 2016 by myself and Mike and Hallie Thompson, and our goal is to place fellows in Jefferson City to act as resources to the legislators in our state government. So very similar to the work that AAAS does here in DC, but at the state level. So we don't consider ourselves a student organization. We think that we're a fellowship program that's run by students, but we are trying to hire full-time staff or support staff who can run this program after we graduate. So our goal is to end up not being a student-run organization, but for right now, we're really happy about the support that we get as students. But as you can see here, our fellows will eventually serve as resources for legislators, both in drafting bills, serving as witnesses in public hearings, and then also really just being a resource at the Capitol when legislators have questions about science. So when the legislators aren't in session, it wasn't really initially in our plans to become an advocacy group or to advocate for science policy. But when we saw the application for the Bipartisan Civic Engagement Initiative, we thought, wow, that would actually maybe fit in really nicely with what our goals are. And so we thought that it would be great to become more active in trying to connect policymakers and scientists and citizens outside of just the work that we hope our fellows will do at the Capitol in Jefferson City. So we put together a proposal to host science policy cafes, and so they were supposed to be a mix, or we intended them to be a mix of a science cafe, so where scientists would be able to present their research in an informal manner in a public setting, in a digestible way so that the public could understand it, so no technical jargon. And then follow that up with a candidate forum where candidates would be able to answer questions related to science and how they see science as fitting into the role of policymaking. So we propose to have 4 of these events in St. Louis, Kansas City, Rolla, and Columbia, where our 4 flagship universities are located. And we ended up being able to host 1 in Columbia and then 2 watch parties for a Senate debate. And so just an idea of what the scientists talked about, we had everything from a graduate student who focuses on cattle genetics and how that improves production in rural Missouri for farmers. We had someone talk about gestational diabetes, and also in St. Louis we had scientists talk about community health care and the opioid crisis in that area. So these were topics that were really relevant to the communities, and we wanted the candidates to be able to get exposed to that research as well. So I mentioned we were only able to host 1 candidate forum, and that was in Boone County. We found out really quickly how hard it is to coordinate asking candidates to come to an event, coordinating scientists, finding a space, getting everybody's schedule to line up. So we did have one in Columbia. We had 5 candidates attend from local House districts, from 5 different districts. And we had 3 scientists talk at the beginning. The candidates talk and answer questions based on the Great Science Debate questions. And overwhelmingly, there was a response from the scientists that when asked about climate change, yes, we think we need to be doing something about it, but we're not the experts. We don't know what to do about it. When asked about sustainable food systems, candidates said, yes, we think they're important, but we aren't the expert. And it's really exemplified in this quote from Adrian Plank, who was running in the 47th district. He said, "I'm not a scientist, I'm a union carpenter, and I will rely on scientists when I get elected. If you're a scientist, you need to use your voice." And so I think that all the scientists in the room, it was mostly graduate students, it really encouraged us to continue doing this work and continue connecting with policymakers and elected officials. And we also, we live tweeted and live streamed this to try to increase our audience, but we also ended up having some media coverage as well at a local newspaper and the local NPR station, and we were really excited about that. Rather than hosting other candidate forums, and actually I will note, so we had a very important race in Missouri. We were talking with both McCaskill and Hawley's campaigns about coordinating a candidate forum with them about science, but they got a little busy. We didn't end up getting to pull it off. But we decided rather to host watch parties. So these were structured in the same manner. We had scientists talk at the beginning, and then we followed it up by watching a debate that was broadcast throughout the state in St. Louis. We had 2 of these watch parties, one in St. Louis and one in Columbia, and we fortunately got to hear a little bit of their response on science because they were asked a question about climate change. And Claire McCaskill noted that we need to listen to our scientists. So again, really empowered the scientists in the room who were listening to take action and become advocates for science policy in our state. And again, got a little bit of media coverage. We were excited. So just a couple thoughts on how the process went. So as a student group on campus, or an organization run by students, we tend to plan things on campus because it's convenient. Our watch parties were planned off campus, and we had a lot higher attendance at those events. And it really, I think, captured the demographic we were looking for as well. So we aren't just trying to get the word out to students, we're really trying to reach the broader community. And so I think looking back, we maybe would have tried to hold these events off campus and reached a wider network when we advertised for the events. And we also found it very important to have a backup plan. So we thought that these 4 candidate forums were going to be easy to put together. Of course, we knew it was going to be work, but coming up with the plan that we would host watch parties instead allowed us to still engage with citizens, scientists, and the policymaking process, and allow people to be able to engage in these events and find out about our organization and what we're doing in the state. And then I think long-term, what this did was it created a model for us to be able to host these advocacy events or events to try to bring scientists and policymakers together in the future. So even though we're still in development, still working to place fellows in the Jefferson City in our capital in Jefferson City, we are able to do something now to get the discussion started in our state and hopefully generate support for our program moving forward. So that's all I've got. We'd love to connect with you on our website or Facebook, Twitter. We thank Research America again for funding these midterm events. And also, this was not just our group alone. We had several other groups that helped at a local level in inviting candidates, coordinating the events, and coordinating the scientists especially. So thank you so much. And I don't think I get questions, so I'm happy to talk with you after. Thank you.
I think that was just terrific, and we just look forward to your future, Rachel, as a scientist and an advocate for science. Just terrific. Thank you. So now we're going to move into our panel discussion, something that I know we're all really looking forward to. So as I introduce our moderator and our panelists, if you would come up and take a seat, that would be great. We're delighted, so pleased to have Yamisha Alcindor with us today as our moderator. Yamisha is the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour and a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC. And before joining the NewsHour, she worked as a national political reporter for the New York Times, where she covered presidential campaigns and the Congress. You might have seen her at a press conference in the White House yesterday, just being a consummate professional. I salute you. Yeah. Also joining us for the panel, we have Research America's chair, the Honorable Mike Castle, a former two-term governor of Delaware, 9-term U.S. congressman, lieutenant governor, deputy attorney general, and state senator, and these days a partner in DLA Piper's government affairs practice. Also joining us, we have the Honorable Bart Gordon, a Research America board member and partner at K&L Gates here in Washington. He served 26 years as U.S. Congressman from the 6th District of Tennessee, and his service included being chairman of the House Committee on Science and Technology. And I wonder if we have Mr. Porter here. Okay, John Porter, where are you? John Porter, walking through here, okay. Joining us, the Honorable John Edward Porter is Research America's Chair Emeritus and Senior Advisor in the law firm of Hogan Lovells, U.S. He served 21 years as U.S. Congressman from the 10th District in Illinois, and served on the Appropriations Committee and is chair of the Subcommittee of Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education. Dr. Sudha Parikh, a Research America board member also, something all these gentlemen have in common, and Senior Vice President, Managing Director at DIA Americas. Dr. Parikh served previously as Science Advisor and Professional Staff to the U.S. Senate Appropriations Committee, where he was responsible for negotiating budgets for the NIH, the CDC, ARC, CMS, BARDA, and other agencies. Thank you all for being with us today, and I'll turn things over to you, Yamisha. Is that on? Hello?
Yeah, it's on. Of course, they told me how to turn on the mic as soon as I sat down. I forgot. So thank you so much, Wolf, to the audience for being here, and thank you so much for joining me on this panel. There's a lot to talk about. This is a timely discussion because we just got out of the midterms and just started 2020 a little too soon. So the first question I have is, now that we know that we're going to have a divided government with the Republicans controlling the Senate and Democrats controlling the House, talk to me a little bit about how you think that funding with science might fare in this new climate. Anyone can take that question.
Well, my own belief is that it will actually improve funding opportunities for science in general. I'm from the state of Delaware. I happen to be a Republican. I was able to get elected there, I guess, about a dozen times or something like that statewide. As of today, there is not a single statewide Republican office holder in Delaware. The two people standing for election at the federal level were Democrats as well, and our legislature is controlled by the Democrats in both the House and the Senate. And even when I was there as governor, we had a divided legislature, the Senate being Democrat and the House occasionally Republican, occasionally Democrat. And as a result, I've gotten used to this sort of divided government, if you will. Same thing when I was in Congress, when Bart and I, John, were all in Congress. We had divisions between the political parties, but I think it works pretty well. I think there's a sort of an ameliorating effect when you have that division. And obviously, the big talk now is because the Democrats control the House, they're going to go after Trump. Well, they're going to go after him, I think, in terms of investigations or whatever. I think that the wiser heads there are saying, forget about impeachment. That's not what this is all about. But we want to learn more about what's happening in terms of the White House or whatever it may be. But the bottom line is, I think you will find that there's going to be a necessity that the parties work together in order to advance their own agendas. And I think that is going to help with science research, perhaps medical research in particular, more than having just a one-party system, if you will. I will say this for the Republican Party, and that is that, and John Porter was a major part of this, but the bottom line is that there's been a real change in terms of medical research in particular within the Republican Party, much more support than used to exist when I first came to Congress, and as a result, places like the NIH, CDC are funded much better than they used to be, even under Republicans. I think now the whole world of scientific research is going to be opened up a little more than it was before.
And John, you look like you're going to lean over on your seat to talk a little bit about what you think.
Ibichi, thank you for your question to the President about nationalism, which you didn't answer, of course, but your question was right on.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Let me kind of agree with Mike on the overall increase in attention to science, but let me disagree specifically, because the difficulty with the labor age bill where NIH is funded and CDC is funded and all the rest is that it is a bill where the Republicans have had one priority, and that was medical research. All the rest of the programs in the bill, they couldn't care less about. They're Democratic programs like mental health and you could name them all, but lots of programs there that are Democratic priorities. So what it will mean when the Democrats take over the House is that the chairman is going to be really lobbied to provide funding for all those programs, and NIH is going to have to compete for that funding. Now, you're probably going to get a pretty good allocation to the committee in the House. They'll have more money to work with, but the priorities will be divided like they haven't been under the Republicans. Secondly, I wonder if they're going to be able, you're going to be able to answer this, whether they're going to be able to have a budget. It seems to me that probably what will happen is that the House and the Senate will have different budgets. They won't be able to conference them, probably, and that will mean that the House marks up according to its allocations and budget, Senate marks up according to its allocations and budget, and then they resolve these differences in the subcommittee conferences informally. They don't have any conferences anymore, do they? I don't know. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. But I think it's going to be first of all, it's the reason that we have to get to, I assume Rosa DeLore was going to be the chairman, but maybe not. Who knows? We have to get to the new chairman early and really make the case for getting funding for medical research and public health. So I've talked way too long, I'm sorry.
Feel free to go.
Sure. If we talk about science funding in general, I'd say there is a lot of support for science funding. The challenge is that science funding takes up a large portion of domestic discretionary spending. And so if you're going to grow the NIH, if you're going to grow the CDC, if you're going to grow the NSF, or the science programs in the DoD for that matter, you have to have growth in overall discretionary spending. And as Mr. Porter said, that requires a growth in the budget caps. And that budget cap deal ends in FY19. So FY19, yes, things look strong. The NIH appropriations passed. There are some challenges for the agencies that are funded in the CJS bill. One of the reasons why is that J stands for justice. And there's a whole bunch of stuff going on at the Department of Justice that might hold that bill up. And so you could end up in a CR for the rest of the year, and that would limit FY19. The FY20 becomes a real challenge because we don't have those budget caps yet. So that's a really important marker for how these scientific programs will do. Is there an increase in the overall domestic discretionary spending?
And you talk about agencies, and I'll put this question to you, Mr. Gordon, if that's okay. Tell me a little bit about whether or not you think different agencies might see different funding levels based on what Republicans and Democrats can do working together.
I'm sorry.
What do you think Democrats and Republicans can do together, varying by agencies? Do you think that the NIH might have different funding than the CDC? I'm sorry to call on you like that. I figured I would let you jump in.
First, let me, if I could, real quickly go back to Rachel. I really was impressed with your presentation. I suspect that a lot of those group meetings were maybe no bigger than this. You have to grow them, but to give those folks a little bit of maybe confidence, if you'll watch over the next 2 weeks as these last, I think, 14 House seats get decided, you're going to see a lot of seats decided by 12 votes, by 50 votes, excuse me, probably by a number smaller than some of your group meetings. So, it is important. So, again, thank you for that. I think to answer your question, and maybe let me go back to the bigger question, and I think there's good news and bad news. Things in the Senate are going to be about the same. You have to have 60 to get anything done. So just because Republicans got 2 or 3 more, then you're at the same place. In the House, it will be different. There will be more advocacy for both funding, and there will be advocacy to respect science and integrity of science. Then you get to your question of agency by agency, which to some extent goes to what John had talked about, and that is that everybody has an Aunt Sally or a child that has a medical disease or a problem, and they would like to see it either cured or quality of life improved. So medical research is always going to be, I think, at an advantage. However, with the sequestration, and I know that may be a term that a lot of you aren't familiar with, but by and large, there was a deal made a few years ago because of budget deficits, that the idea was, we got to make a deal that's so bad nobody will want to do it. Well, that bluff has been called, and there's about a $54 billion hole that's going to be in discretionary spending soon. And you're going to have Democrats are talking about a pay-as-you-go budget. So if you do that, then you can't continue with big tax cuts and big spending. And so they try to revisit the tax cuts, which probably won't be successful. So to me, the strategy is not to be worrying about which of the different agencies are going to come out better, but working with the coalition that Mary has helped put together that's going to be advocating for all science research and trying to, make folks realize that it's through education, investing in research that you get innovation, and through innovation, you're going to get, new drugs and new cures, but you're also going to get, with AI, you're going to get a better ability to aggregate big data, which will help medical research as well as others. Research in autonomous cars is going to help Aunt Sally get to the hospital by herself or to the doctor's office. So I think it needs to be across the board advocating.
The president yesterday said if Democrats don't investigate him, he's willing to work with them on several issues. One of those issues was science. He was talking about, and this president has talked a lot about pharmaceutical companies. How do you think drug pricing might be dealt with the new Congress and the president? Again, anybody can answer.
I mean, there's probably a few areas where they could work together that are politically popular. I could name off a few of them just as a list. There's the CREATES Act. There's Medicaid rebate caps. There's cracking down on pay for delay. There are the 340B issues. These could be. There are probably places for compromise there. Again, I think it comes very much down to how well do the new leaders work together to approach these, and what could they be coupled with? Is there enough political momentum to carry those as one package of drug pricing issues? I think there is, to be honest. I mean, if you look at the polls, drug pricing ranks pretty high up there for things to address by this Congress. So there is momentum for that. And then what that really means is that the folks in this community need to make sure that if there is momentum towards some piece of legislation, that it is one that doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. So is it one where we make sure we continue innovation while we do address the drug prices? There's not many things that my mom talks to me about in politics. Drug pricing is one of them. It's not my Aunt Sally, it's my mom, but it is. That's where I get the calls.
Let me add to that a bit. I think something like 61% of the Democratic ads that were run in this election that were positive were about health care. And I doubt many of them advocated for additional funding for health care. It was that drug prices were too expensive and that health care in general is too expensive. So let me give you this scenario and the potential impact. By and large, you pay more for your medication in the United States than anywhere else in the world. And that generally is because everywhere else in the world, they negotiate down prices. So the drug companies come and they'll say, if you want Aunt Sally to get that new medication, or if you want, your child to be able to have a better quality of life, then we have to have research for the new medication. And you can't have research if you don't make a profit. And so we have to charge enough to make a profit. So some are going to come back and say, that's fine, we understand that, but why do you have to charge all the profit in the United States? So then, do you get to a situation somehow where you put the pharmaceutical companies in a position of ratcheting down, where they have to go to France or England or elsewhere and say, you're going to have to pay more. And they say, well, we're not going to pay more. Well, then fine, you don't get it. And what is that impact going to have? So, that's something to be watching, because if there is any common denominator, it is reduce the price of cost of healthcare, particularly drugs, in the United States. So there will be, byproducts to that.
The other question I want to ask you is about, or ask all of you, is about the idea that there's so much news, that the news cycles are so quick right now. There's so much, some people say saturation of the news. How do you think scientists and science research can be discussed on a national level? If you were in office still, what would you be trying to do to try to talk about and make sure that science was something that people in this nation was thinking about? Maybe I'll go to Mr. Castle, yeah.
Well, when we mention the news or the media, we're not just talking about the news and the media as we thought about it 10 years ago or whatever. We are thinking about all the bloggers and all the individuals who fancy themselves as being experts on the news and write their own releases and send things out or whatever. I mean, there's just a barrage of information which is going out, which has really changed the world. And it seems to me that one of the arguments is a lack of belief in science in general. There are politicians out there who are basically saying, and unfortunately a lot of them are Republicans, but saying that we don't believe in the global warming which is going on. We don't believe in a variety of other things which are happening out there. And they're backed by a lot of individuals, even a few scientists, a handful perhaps, who support their positions with respect to that. And that makes it very complicated to get the message across. But it does seem to me that people who are truly interested in science in general, maybe medical research in more particular, should be the advocates on that side of it, who are doing their own blogging, trying to achieve their own positive stories in all of this. And I think one of the problems with research is connecting research to whatever the achievements are. In the area of medicine, it's relatively simple. I mean, we saw it with polio, we've seen it with AIDS, we've seen it in a variety of areas in which some research has basically led to solutions to some of the problems which have existed out there. And I think that's true of science in general as well. We need to connect whatever the basic research that's being done, perhaps sponsored out of the various states and the United States government in terms of funding, to ultimately a solution that's helping people somehow or another. And that's a very important step. But I would encourage anybody here today to not be afraid to stand up for what you believe in, to help spread the word, because the bottom line is that there are fewer people reading newspapers and watching the news and paying more attention to the blog sites which they favor.
Mr. Ward?
I think one of the positive developments of the challenge by China for world economic and political domination is the fact that Americans are waking up to the need for STEM education, especially young people. And I think that is going to lead us to more evidence-based decision-making that we absolutely have to have once we get a new president, that is. Can I be political here? I guess I am being political. But I think that there's positive developments among young people to see that decisions are made in a way that match science and match common understanding. And I think that's all to the good.
To answer your question, I say never waste a challenge, never waste a disaster, and that's a tough thing to say. But we are often faced with challenges that science can't address. These can be whether it's monitoring for earthquakes, whether it's doing better climate models, whether it's attacking chronic disease with stem cells or regenerative medicine. And whenever these opportunities arise, we have to be timely and focused in those conversations. And this is not a one-time event. Political advocacy is a constant that starts with talking to folks in the minority party as well as the majority party, because frankly things move back and forth here. And folks who are state legislators today will be congressmen tomorrow and congresswomen tomorrow. And so it is at all levels, and it is a constant conversation that has to happen. And I believe that every time there is something that is timely, whether it's news about immunotherapy or whether it's monitoring of earthquakes in California, those need to be talked about, and talked about the opportunities that are there for the science.
May I connect the dots a little bit on this? Even though we have record low unemployment, the stock market is going up, we still have a lot of folks that were making $15 or $20 an hour 8 or 10 years ago, and they still are making the same amount. And there are people that that are employed now, they're making $25, and now they're making $20. And I think that to some extent was reflected in this election. So let's go back to the common phrase that it's the economy, stupid. And I think that you have to relate these things to the economy. And you do that, I think, certainly John brought up a good point in that as China ellipses us in a GDP maybe in 3 or 4 years, that's going to be a wake-up call. And we have to recognize, how do you address that? Well, the reason that the United States was so dominant in the last part of the 20th century is our secret sauce was investing in education and research, which gave us innovation and new products and kept us out in front. So, we have to do that. But it's hard for folks to recognize, an investment now for a result 10 years from now, which goes back to what Mike had said, is we have to really focus on our prior investments and what we get for them, whether they're cures. In my example, for example, is that I created a new agency in the Department of Energy called ARPA-E, Advanced Research Agency for Energy, which it's high risk, high reward in the energy sector. And I think it's been making great strides. However, I could have never gotten that done if it wasn't for DARPA, because DARPA was my model. And I could say, we had DARPA, we invested there, and we got the internet. Wasn't that a good investment? So you take Mike's, again, take whatever cure that you want to, and that came about probably initially out of some investments at NIH or elsewhere.
What you're talking about made me think about, really what all of you are talking about, made me think about a story that I wrote for the New York Times maybe 2 years ago. And it was a story that felt counterintuitive to me. I was covering social safety nets at the time, covering people of color, covering poverty in this country for of course, both white and black and all sorts of races. And the president pulled out of the Paris Accord, and the question I asked myself was, well, how does this relate to my beat? And I started just calling up a couple scientists, and they were like, well, that basically is your beat. Like, poor people and the environment and sciences, these are the people who will bear the brunt of this. Can you talk a little bit about just everyday, like actual poor people and people who are working outside? What is the impact of all the things that we're talking about on those populations? Anybody? Take that. Even though I was looking at you, Mr. Gordon. Yeah, but could you talk a little bit about, the impact of science and research among poor people and how they seem to possibly will be the biggest beneficiaries, but could also be the people most hurt if some of these things don't get funded and we don't look into the environment or look into lowering drug prices.
Well, think about fertilizer. Think about agriculture. The advances in agriculture has made food cheaper. I mean, it's still amazing to me that, what is it? I don't know whether it is about $4 a gallon for of milk. You know what it takes to do milk? I mean, to feed them, to milk them, to get it to you. I mean, there has been, great progress there. If you think about, climate change, for example, so many of if you want to say the poor people, live in low-lying areas of the country that are less desirable. And climate change, New Orleans, for example, is, you can see what happened down there with some of those, lesser wards, the lower income wards. So, that's going to impact them. Just a higher quality of life is going to, I hate to use the word trickle down, but will trickle down to benefit everybody.
I can start with the opioid crisis. This latest legislation that just passed, this is science that is going to be helping not just any one demographic, because frankly the opioid crisis affects everyone, but it is centered in areas of the country that have been struggling economically. This is a place where you can have research that goes for different types of medication that are not addictive. It's a place where you can look at ways to mitigate the addiction, ways to reduce the suffering from withdrawal. These are scientific questions, but they are squarely going to be aimed at folks who are struggling economically.
Well, I'd just like to comment on the whole area. My own feeling, you hear attacks that this member of Congress, whatever, is trying to take away your Medicare or Social Security or reduce it or whatever it may be. And the truth of the matter is that both Medicare and Social Security are going to have funding issues. But I will guarantee you one thing, people of that generation, which I'm one, vote. And I don't think anybody in Congress is going to take away anybody's Social Security or Medicare, if I had to guess. My sense is they take money away from something else first to make sure that those things are funded, unless they can add revenue to it in some way or another. And they're going to have to address that problem sooner rather than later, particularly in the area of Medicare. And I think in terms of those programs which help those who are younger but are relatively poor or perhaps underemployed or whatever it may be, that's an issue too that's going to have to be addressed, and I think it will be. And I think the fact that the Democrats are in charge of the House is a block on either eliminating or reducing a lot of those programs, and some of them may expand. On the other hand, I think that proper pressure on corporations and businesses to try to be helpful in that area is important as well. I just soon not have people on government programs. I just soon have them being paid well enough that they can subsist without depending upon those government programs.
I'm going to let Mr. Porter take that, but we're going to go to Q&A after Mr. Porter speaks it, or someone else wants to speak after Mr. Porter. But if there are questions that you have, start writing them down, start thinking about them. I'm going to go to the first person that makes it to that mic, I think. So please start formulating your questions.
Well, all I was going to say is that I think the Social Security and Medicare can be adjusted prospectively so that you aren't affecting anybody currently. You're affecting people in the future. And
That's what happened in '83.
Yeah.
But in a bipartisan way.
Yeah, I think this, it's good. We know it has to happen to make the program sound. So what you do is you do it now for people that maybe even aren't voting age yet. And then you get away with it. So that's all I wanted to say.
Should have done it 5 years ago.
Okay. Up for questions. Anybody have a question for our panel? Don't be shy. You just walk to the mic so we can hear you, please.
Thank you all for being here. I had a question about another potential place for bipartisan compromise. That's the topic of infrastructure, which I've heard a lot about. I wondered to get your perspective on the chance for some kind of infrastructure bill making it through this next Congress, and if there would be potential impacts on science, or maybe to strengthen some of the scientific infrastructure in our country.
If there's one common denominator in Congress with the administration, it's infrastructure. If there's one non-common denominator, it's how do you pay for it. I'm hopeful that earlier, President Trump said that he would support, I think it was a 25-cent gas tax increase. We saw that they tried to bring down a 12-cent increase in California through a referendum, and the public voted against doing away with that. They wanted the tax. The industry wants some type of a tax. It's going to be very difficult, but if that can occur, then, and you can get some additional revenue, then you could do some bonding, you could put that into an infrastructure bank and try to get some multiples out of it. So then going to your question about how does that, then filter its way into research. Everybody wants to get their hand in infrastructure, and it's going to be defined in the broadest way. I was talking to the Chief of Staff of the minority on Energy and Commerce the other day. People have talked about broadband being part of it, but he wants to get money for hospitals and let that be also part of infrastructure. So, we all should be hopeful. I guess we could put it this way: if they can't do something in infrastructure, then might as well, put your tent down and go home.
Could happen.
On infrastructure with hospitals and elsewhere, in the past, the place where we had that was in something called earmarks. So if you go down to the University of Alabama, Birmingham, if you go to West Virginia University, if you go to Penn, if you go to Penn State, there's a lot of buildings on those campuses that are funded by earmarks. Earmarks were considered a dirty word in 2010, and I know that. But I can tell you that they were the sugar that helped the medicine go down. We had the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Appropriations Bill, which is a challenging bill to pass, passed with many Republican votes when there were earmarks in it that included funding for hospitals and other things. And the Republicans had earmarks for many, many years. I'm a firm believer that most of these in the past were okay, they were good. Those buildings at the University of Alabama, Birmingham are doing good science. That said, there's a need for oversight of that, but that actually helps the legislative process move forward. So it's not exactly infrastructure, but I think it's a really important thing to note that those pieces of specific legislation are really powerful in helping the government work.
Well, Sudeep, as he always does, puts his finger on something that's terribly important. And the question then is, can they be brought back and stop calling them earmarks? You call them directed funding or something. And when I became chairman of the subcommittee, after being on it in the minority for 14 years, where there were no earmarks, interestingly enough, the Democrats didn't allow them. I brought them back in instantly because I knew that medical research funding was concentrated on the east and west coasts with not much in between. And by allowing earmarks for building, along with state funds and private funds and local funds, funding for medical research facilities, that has broadened out the base. And when you broaden out the base, you get the votes to pass it and enthusiasm for it. And so, Sudeep, my question for you is, do you think they can bring them back and put some limits on them and transparency and change the name and all the rest?
It's certainly on the table again.
Yeah, the Democrats have already discussed this, and if just a few Republicans, will not squeal too much, then I think you will see, what do you use the term, earmark come back, but in what I would call an OB kind of way. And an OB was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee some time back, and he really brought new transparency because there had been, abuses, and where you have to publicly, put them in the record, you're going to have to defend them. I would say that you should even have to go to the authorizing committee and get them authorized, and then go to the appropriators. So there will be an effort to do that with the appropriate amount of transparency.
Our next question.
Thanks. On that last point, by the way, I always said to my constituents, this was congressionally originated funding as opposed to OMB-originated funding. And they generally like that. On another matter, I hear from a number of scientists now who are talking about what might be called long-term or out-year appropriations for research. They point to the fluctuations that occurred in the NIH funding a few years back, and that the fluctuations they felt were really damaging to the research process. I realize that a lot of people outside of science, in infrastructure and other matters, can talk about this, but it's gaining some interest in the science community. Is it possible to, they ask, to have a 2 or 3 or 5 year funding window for research projects? They say, for example, when an aircraft carrier is funded, you can count on the out years to complete that project. How would something like that happen with research?
Sudeep is the expert on this, but my sense of it is that if you have research pushing for forward funding, everything else is going to push for forward funding too.
Right.
And that may work. It may force the Congress to decide what the priorities are. And maybe they can only do forward funding. PBS was forward funded for 2 years and worked very well. It was actually the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but it amounted to the same thing because that's what funds stations that put on public broadcasting. But it seems to me Sudeep's going to have a better answer than I could ever have to this because he understands what the pressures are. So, Sudeep, what's the answer?
Give us that great answer.
That's a big build-up.
It was a very big build-up.
I think that there are selected programs where you can do this. So, for example, the Precision Medicine Initiative, or now All of Us, for programs like the BRAIN Initiative, where you've seen this sort of coming together of the advocacy community and also a plan from the NIH. And I think that's what's really important, is to have both the advocacy community looking at the question as being important, but then also the scientific opportunity and a plan and a strategy from the scientific leadership matches up with that advocacy. And so when there are opportunities like the 21st Century Cures Act and others to put together these large programs, that works well. I think outside of those, when it's R01 grant process, that's really, it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to justify whenever you're talking about putting that beside of community health centers is also a place where, boy, some stability sure would be nice. So I think it's very hard there. But for things that equate to an aircraft carrier, the All of Us program equates to an aircraft carrier, and it's going to require 10 years of funding.
I would, first of all, like to thank Rush for hosting this today. He was a member of Congress for a number of years, as you probably know. And if you're not impressed by that, he's also a multiple winner on Jeopardy, which impressed me a hell of a lot, since I get about maybe 10% of the questions correct when they ask them. I just think that any kind of continuing funding is going to be very difficult for the exact reason somebody mentioned, and that is that everyone's going to ask for it. It's not going to be just in areas of research or even limited research, medical research or something of that nature, but in general. And you do get that a little bit more with the defense projects, because there's theoretically a set cost, so I think that's a little questionable. And people are going to know they're going to be back funding it in the future years. But I think it's going to be difficult to implement that. So I think it's certainly a reasonable request. I understand the scientists who worry about the ups and downs or whatever it may be. But I think it's the reason we need to get the science community as you have said yourself, Rush, more involved in terms of being able to advocate and be able to keep a balance and a flow as far as all that's concerned. Because I don't think you're going to get a continuous 5-year projected funding system in place for one thing and not something else.
So we only have 2 minutes left. So maybe we'll do a round robin if everybody wants to maybe just closing thoughts, 30 seconds. I know you guys are all politicians, but you have 30 seconds to talk.
Well, I'll start with my 30 seconds. I don't. This election is an interesting election. Obviously, it's a reflection of the president to a great degree. But the bottom line is that I think the divided Congress is actually going to end up being more positive than one might think. As a Republican or as a Democrat, one might think. Clearly, the president still has some strength within the Senate, but there is a certain effect there in terms of having a Democrat House that he's going to have to live with, and he may have to change the way he approaches his business. I hope that he does, and I hope that things like the infrastructure question and anything that helps the people of this country, regardless of what their politics is able to get done here in the next couple of years.
Never give up, never give up, and never give up.
I'm not a politician. I just work for
I know, see, you're the only one. But he went so quickly that he upped the game.
I'm not going to be that quick. I'm going to say leadership matters. The one thing we didn't talk about, and I agree with everything that's been said, is that if you take a step back and look at the leadership in, let's say, health research in this administration, Francis Collins is at NIH, Scott Gottlieb is at FDA, Alex Azar is at HHS. You know, you may not agree with them on every issue, and you may have some big disagreements with them, but it's hard to argue that they're not strong leaders for health in this space. And with changes that are possible because of dominoes in the cabinet, let's just make sure that we continue to have these great leaders, because if you look at other parts of the government where maybe there's been some other challenges because of leadership, things can go wrong very quickly. So I think we're actually very fortunate in the health ecosystem, the biomedical research ecosystem, to have the leaders that we have and where we're headed.
Advocacy matters. Get out there and advocate and work for what you believe in. It makes all the difference. If you sit on the sidelines and watch it go by, it will not go your direction. Advocacy matters. Work with Research America, AAAS, and others to make a difference for this country.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all four of you. I really appreciate this conversation.
And thank you, Yamiche. We're delighted to have you with us today. We wish you all the best. Keep doing good things. So I hope you have taken away some insights from this hour and a half today. And I also hope that you'll stay connected to us at Research America. There is a lot of advocacy to be done going forward, including in the lame duck. We've got an agenda, all of us, that includes being sure that Dr. Kelvin Drogemeyer is affirmed by the full Senate so that we have leadership at the OSTP. We want to make sure that the remaining science agencies that haven't been funded for FY19 do get that funding, and good solid funding at that. It's also everybody's job to be reaching out to build champions among the new members of Congress. There's, roughly speaking, about 100 new members, and we'll find out exact numbers over the next few weeks. 100. That's a lot of people who have the potential to make the kind of difference, to be the kind of leaders that we need if we're going to see progress as well as continued partisanship, because we will see some of that as well. I think there's every reason to feel positive, and I might add that among those 100 are at least 7 science-trained folks who will be joining the Congress, which is great news too. So I thank you all for being with us and for joining us in a forward-going way to be advocates, to step up to the plate, not watch the world go by and moan and groan, but make sure that we have an impact for our nation and everyone in it going forward. So I thank you, and I thank our terrific staff at Research America and our great board. Have a good day, and hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye.